Goals. Why do we have them? That may seem like a difficult question to answer. It just seems like a matter of course that if you have a life to live with energy, with desires, with thoughts, with beliefs, with relationships, with possessions, with needs, with wants, with wishes, whether fully baked or half formed, that it would only make sense that we would have goals. But on some level, all of those mentionings are, I would think, ex post facto justifications, hindsight justifications. It seems obvious on the flip side of things, having lived much of life. But I think if we're too flippant about it, it gets to a point where you might miss the ways in which your own petri dish environment influenced your perception of how natural or obvious or not goals are. In some sense, that dismissiveness, if we're too quick about it, could cause any one of us to miss how we've introjected certain things. But because of that lack of reflection, because of that lack of integration between those goals and what we carry with us from day to day, even as dynamically of changing beings as we are, we may fail to actually make those goals genuinely our own. And yet, we do have them. And in some sense, even in a very narrow sense, just by picking a simple example, we can understand something about what goals are and why we care about them, and therefore why we have them. So, something very simple as an example, why is it that I have a goal to, and this isn't me necessarily personally, I guess I should use one of my own personal examples, but let's just say a person in question has a goal to be a famous opera singer and sing at the Metropolitan Opera House. Why, we might ask. It's interesting because I've been in situations where I have asked people that, and you would think they would quickly be able to answer by how many resources, like money and college applications and years spent in cities away from home, training and auditioning, getting rejected. You would think for all that investment that they would be able to quickly answer, oh, of course, here are all the reasons why. But oftentimes what you start to discover is that the reasons they offer are not in any way really tied to who they fundamentally take themselves to be at the deepest of levels. And it starts to fragment or come apart. You start to realize, oh, maybe I got baked into a larger system and those goals were tied to that system. And so those goals also got baked into me. Because on some level, when you strip certain accidents of history and society and biography away, what's left? Is it music? Do you love music? Do you love just singing? Is that what began? Why opera? And that's where certain things might come into play. Maybe opportunity presented itself in such a way that the medium through which you were going to sing was opera. Maybe your high school teacher had that background. They heard your voice and they suggested, hey, try this direction. You spontaneously decided to audition for a local college. You get a scholarship and you go. And voila, you're moving along and you're racing ahead. You're not really taking any breaks to pause and reflect. Why am I doing this? Oftentimes, it's possible that upon further reflection, we realize we're doing it because we've got to do something. Because if we didn't have something to fill the gap, what would life be? And I think that in many ways, so many of the goals that we've strongly attached to, and that we really, in many ways, try to imbibe in such a way, almost like magic or manna that is supposed to give us sustenance and life and meaning, ultimately underneath everything ends up being empty. And really the goal isn't a positive goal, but it's a negative goal. And what I mean by that is I'm not trying to achieve or acquire something of value, but rather I am trying to stave off the abyss. I am trying in some way to protect myself from having to see or experience a possible void, or to experience the idea or the thought or the reality that there isn't something stable and lasting about myself. And it leads me into a thought about types of goals then. Are there types of goals? And I thought a useful framing would be personal goals versus transcendent goals. I think it can help explain some things that might otherwise seem mysterious in this particular day and age, this particular zeitgeist, at least in this part of the globe where I happen to live, in the United States, which is that despite all of our personal goals and in this hustle culture, you hear things like Jocko Willink saying, discipline is freedom. You have the rise of people like Jordan Peterson as well, and other motivational speakers who make a lot of money on, in many ways, inflating the ego. So you feel these negative things. You feel depression. You feel anxiety. You feel fear. You feel danger, insecure, because in this fast-moving society, there are so many incentives, many of them economic, and then obviously socially and politically enforced as well, because it's all integrated by way of money. There is this expectation from organizations increasingly, not only that you play a certain circumscribed role tied to whatever their rationalized goals are, but that increasingly beyond that, you have certain attributes and traits that can be picked up by psychometric data. Flexibility and quickly being able to learn something new, adaptability. These are things that you generally have to be able to do, and to learn something new very quickly, because there is, as Schumpeter described it, a sort of unbridled, accelerating creative destruction that is happening in all networks, so that any sort of structural integrity you might have been tempted to lean on external to yourself in order to feel some security and identity in life is not present anymore. So it becomes something like the interiorization of happiness, which is really how the happiness industry has increasingly, like Martin Seligman, I think, and what was his name? Januszewski, I forget, Hungarian, but this internalization of happiness. In many ways, we have become accountable for life's stability and meaning. And so, insofar as there aren't stable communities and ways of being outside of ourselves, insofar as regulation can no longer be counted upon as at least coming partially from outside of ourselves, leading to a greater state of disarray or social anomie, as Durkheim would call it, then what we have now is to fill the wounds, the gaps, personal goals. So everything is about to-do lists and improving yourself and healing and growing and becoming. And that ultimately, if something is wrong in your life, it is all of these inner resources that you pull from in order for life to be something that it should be. And yet, for all of these personal goals, are people happier? Are people less anxious? Are we seeing less pathology and neuroses or more around us and within ourselves? And so I think that in some ways, going back to the question of why do we have goals, I think we have to not just think about it in terms of ourselves, but we have to also look at the surrounding social milieu and understand how using something like a principle of historical specificity, taking a cross-section of society right now and looking at it, saying, well, why is it presenting itself in the unique way that it is at this particular time? And the intensity and the rapidity and the quantity of goals we are each carrying for ourselves and feeling a real weight with, not just a desire, not a liberation, but a weight, a burden. This is not accidental, and this is not necessarily baked into the concept of goals in a trans-historical sense. So perhaps I could qualify my initial question, why goals? Why goals in the particular manner in which they manifest themselves with the particular rapidity, quantity, intensity, and all of that? Is that necessary? And is it really about a meaningful life, or is it about survival in some sense? These are just some questions I have. But personal goals oftentimes have been tied to happiness, and that in many ways this is the autonomous medication for healing if you are struggling or if something's not going well. This notion of radical personal responsibility and accountability. And my question is there a better way? And I think there is. I believe that as someone who has many personal goals and who probably works harder than maybe would sometimes be balanced, but I'm working on that. I have found that personal goals, it starts to feel like you need more and more discipline and to go more and more through the motions insofar as they really don't have meaning. And oftentimes a sign that they really don't have enough meaning for you is the more you try to justify them, the more motivational videos you feel like you need to watch, and so on, in order to keep it going. Oftentimes I said, no, discipline's just the name of the game. And I'm not saying discipline isn't required. But it is interesting how much discipline before we start to wonder whether that is just a natural feature of things or whether that's a sign of something else behind it all. Maybe there's an inverse relationship between how much discipline you need and how much value a personal goal really has in terms of providing meaning for your life. And so what I found is not to that sacrificing my personal goals would be a good thing, but that in some ways I needed something to transcend my personal goals that then the personal goals worked through. A transcendent structure of goals or meaning or values that would serve to canalize all my personal goals. And I think the way I philosophically understood what was happening was as I started relaxing the ego more and being comfortable with dropping the storyline in my own life in a number of ways and just allowing, not identifying or fusing so much with my thoughts or my emotions or the dramas of the moment, and just letting those things work through me, metabolize, and seeing what's left after that. I always felt like that was where real luminosity, real clarity in my mind would come in. And then I could take certain things, like my desire to continue to be as great a pianist as I possibly can be, or my fitness goals or other things like that. I realized those things in and of themselves, taken alone, what they were serving to do was reify, to concretize a self that I had high stakes in maintaining, that in an ultimate sense maybe is smaller than who I am in an unbridled, full experiential way. And so in many ways, it was just reinforcing the walls of a self-imposed and self-perpetuating prison. And when I started finding ways to relax those walls, what was truly liberating and motivating for me was when I realized that transcendent goals should be tied to goals that are bigger than you, bigger than the self, more important than you. And so then my personal goals are measured in terms of value insofar as they serve those transcendent goals. So then it gets structured in a particular way. So going back to the opera singing example, a person's like, oh, I want to sing at the Met. That's my goal. Why? And they might flounder a bit. And it seems like a very localized goal, but because they don't have a transcendent goal overarching that for why they even sing or why they do music. And a transcendent goal might be tied to a value, let's say, of trying to maximize happiness in the causes that lead to it for people and minimize suffering in the causes that lead to it. Or maybe another overarching goal is to use all the powers that you have, limited though they may be, to provide insight and empowerment to those around you. And music is certainly something that could help with that. So then, if your goal, like for me, for example, is to be as excellent a pianist as I can, it's not for my own ego advancement or narrative or to beat anyone or for any competitive reason, but far more meaningful to me is the notion that the more capacity I have with this instrument, the more power I have to wield this beautiful tool of music to transform lives, my own and others. It's just one example. But to me, that is how your life starts to become charged with meaning in a much bigger way. And that led me to a thought about personal goals versus transcendent goals. Again, and the notion that the question even that came to my mind, which is it more important to be happy or to be good? And that hit me in a very powerful way. And I thought more about the ego and the transcendent ideas, the things that are bigger than the ego. And I thought it worked really well. This happiness industry and the goal is to be happy. The goal is to be happy. More pleasure, more well-being for ourselves. And that to me is part of the storyline of the ego narrative that we try to shore up and build. And all of this is the fuel for capitalism. If the ego is allowed to collapse, what would happen? But that's another story for another day. But it's all connected. The hyper emphasis on personal goals, meaning of life, life being equated with ego narrative and storyline, competition, individual, island unto self, bifurcation from community, and all of that is tied to trying to bring to life and keep alive something that ultimately at the end of the day isn't real and most fundamental to your experience. Whereas if we instead move into a direction of where any self-concept we have or personal goals with that is considered more conditional or relative or provisional, and that the unconditional or what is beyond that is more a place of open expanse where we aren't just beings, but we are, as Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese monk, said, we are all interbeing. We are all interconnected. And so everything that we do ends up being something that sees the much larger network. And that to me is what's tied to the good. Transcendent goals are living a life where it's more important that you be good. Good being something that's public. Good implying other people beyond yourself. Whereas happy can seem rather solipsistic. And I think oftentimes when we focus on what makes me happy, it really is the ego front and center, and that's personal goals. So is it more important to be happy, or is it more important to be good? And incidentally enough, is what is commonly associated with happiness, all of these personal goals and the assertion of the self and success. Is that really what happiness is? Or is happiness something that occurs as a byproduct of living a life of goodness, as you understand it, to the best of your ability, a process that unfolds over time, a knowledge that unfolds over time? Certain Tibetan Buddhists would call that the karma of good sila, what results when you are cultivating good seeds, wholesome things. And so maybe happiness is more something that descends upon you when you're pursuing something else, rather than when you're pursuing it alone. So it's an indirect gift. It's not a direct gift, perhaps. These are just some of my passing thoughts about it. So I'll probably title this video Personal Goals versus Transcendent Goals or something like that. I don't know. But on one side, maybe you could imagine you have personal goals, ego, happiness industry. And on the other side, you have transcendent goals, interbeing or connectedness with all others, and goodness. And actually maybe genuine happiness somewhere in there as a reflection of that. And then happiness becomes something that is actually not coherent with the ego. It requires something beyond that. Happiness doesn't exist in any meaningful way, except in a more expansive sense, perhaps. Some of my thoughts before the new year.